What would you do if you were 17 years old, homeless, and down to your last $12? Would you give up? Or would you be on yourself? This is the story of how I went from sleeping in a rusted out car to standing on stages worldwide, and the one decision that changed everything. Because here's the truth, your life doesn't change by chance, it changes by choice, and I made mine that day. She kicked me out, she wasn't going to stab me and kill me, I wasn't worried about dying, but I wasn't going back in that house. And so I did sleep on the hill, and then it rained. I finally just went in. I knocked on the door of a friend. It was a girl, not a girlfriend, but her family really cared about me, and I said, can I sleep in your laundry room? So that's where I was. I had $12 to my name, $13, whatever, and I just took a little bit of money, got on a bus, and I remembered this bookstore. So I went there, and I was just guided to this book, The Magic of Believing. All it really taught was the power of belief. Belief controls everything. Everything you do is based on your belief, but it showed how to program your beliefs by conditioning them. If you use your body and your voice and every ounce of you is congruently speaking that over and over again, it basically hypnotizes you into owning that experience. So I used to write on the mirror in the laundry room, only a loser is depressed, which is not true, but I knew I wasn't a loser, so I used that as leverage. I'm not going to be depressed. Because I was so depressed, Billy. And I had all these affirmations I would do. I'd go on runs and say, every day and in every way, I'm getting stronger and stronger. And I would just program this nervous system of mine until I could really be in a position where I felt like I could succeed. And it worked. It produced tremendous change in me. Reading was my escape, but it was also my transformation. I escaped the world as I entered Emerson's essays. And I've read a lot of autobiographies, especially because when you read an autobiography, you're reading the words of that incredible human being, so you're thinking their thoughts. And if you do that for days or weeks or whatever the case may be, you start to take that on. It's like if you want to play the piano, you can mess around on your own, but if you're smart, you learn other people's music, and all of a sudden, you do some amazing things, but after a while, you play it enough, you learn enough patterns that now you become the creator. Now you start to create your own patterns, and that's pretty much what happened for me with these books, and then also events. I went to seminar after seminar. I had no money. I didn't have money for my rent, but I'd go invest in a seminar because I'd never be able to pay for this until I changed what was going on in me. And I was obsessed with using what I learned because I had to. Because I'd given up all the money I had to do it. When you were 17 years old, you're working at Gendera High School as a janitor. Yes, helping move people on the weekends. And there was a friend of your family's who was a landlord. A very awkward conversation ensued where he said, my parents said, hey, you're such a loser. How are you so successful? So tell us about Jim Rohn and the influence he had on your life and the question that you asked a landlord. And he said, no way, I'm not doing that, you do it yourself. Well, I had to help support my family, enough money for food. So I'm going to school, and I kept 2 different jobs as a janitor because I could work in the middle of the night. And they didn't pay you by the hour, they paid you by the result. So I could do 2 banks in the middle of the night, do a great job, take the buses home, and contribute. And then on the weekends, I would try to find something to do also because you didn't have to do the banks then. And my mom and dad knew this man who, as my dad's words were, used to be such a loser. Now he's so successful. I wonder what happened to him. And all he was doing was buying properties, fixing them up, and flipping them in Orange County, California, in the 1970s like 1977. And the market was exploding, so he was doing very well. So he was very efficient in his workforce to move things, and so he always hired like a high school student. I was 5'1" in my sophomore year, and I got a tumor in my brain. No one knew, that's why, and I grew 10 inches in a year, so I was like, get that big, strapping guy, we'll do this. So I come, and I'm a hard worker, and after 2 days of working my guts out, he's like, you're the hardest working guy I've ever met. He goes, I'm really impressed, let me take you to lunch. So he takes me to lunch, and he starts asking questions. I said, I want to ask you some questions. I said, you know my dad and I wasn't trying to be harsh or funny. He just, when you're a kid, you just don't realize. I said, my dad said you used to be such a loser, now you're so successful. Like, how'd you do that? He was taken aback, obviously. He said, Jay said what? And he goes, well, it's probably pretty accurate about me. I said, but what changed you? And he said, I went to a seminar, and I'd never even heard the word seminar before. I said, what's a seminar? He said, where a man who has become incredibly successful over decades takes all he's learned in the decades and tries to compress it into a few hours or a few days and save you all that trial and error learning. I said, how long is it? Somebody goes, it's 3.5 hours. I said, how much is it? He said, $1.35. It'd be like $2.50 in today's dollars, right? Inflation. And I was making $1.40 a week. So I said, wow, that's expensive. I said, can you get me in? And he's like, yeah, but he wasn't in anymore. I said, well, will you? And he said, no. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, because you won't value it if you don't pay for it. I said, no, 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 I'm on my own. I've been sleeping in my car. I'm working as a janitor. Told him the whole story, right. He goes, I don't hear the story. He said, if you're really committed, you'll go there. Or learn on your own experience and take 10 or 20 or 30 years. Or maybe never figure it out. So I remember sweating bullets with this decision. Do I do a week's pay for this 1 3-hour thing? And I was like, oh my God. And then I went down there. I'd graduated to a 1968 Volkswagen since. My mom had got the other one in Baja. I pulled up in front of the nice hotel in Orange County, California. I was wearing a blue leisure suit, which is what people wore in those days, that I got in the thrift store, fake gold chain, but I was ready to rock and roll, baby. And I went in, talked my way in, and a guy had set this thing up so I could get in. And I sat in that seminar, and I'd read so many books that when Jim Rohn was speaking, I would finish some of his phrases. And you're at a round table. I was somewhat disruptive without meaning to be, but I was so enthusiastic. And then, during a break, I went up to Jim Rohn and told him the story about how I'd been doing all this stuff and I wanted to come to work for him. And he's like, young man, if you want to come work for me, you have to go through all my programs. And so I didn't have that kind of money. I'm sleeping in my car in an old trench coat I got from the thrift store, and I tried to tell him my story, and he said, no, 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 I don't want to hear all that. He said, I'm not your banker, because I said, you could loan me the money, and then I'll go get these great results, and I'll tell everybody that you helped me do this. He goes, no, 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 I'm not your banker. He goes, you know what? If you want to come to work with me, you have to have the money by Saturday. And he said, everybody gets what they have to have. Some people have to survive, some people have to succeed, decide which one you are. And he walked away, and I was pissed off. I was like, I'm struggling, he's rich. I'm willing to pay for it, I just want him to finance it. But another part of my brain started going, he's right, he's right, he's right, like he's right. You've always got what you had to have. And so I was like, okay. So I went to banks, thinking banks will loan you money when you need it, which of course is, I'm sure you know, they only loan you money if you don't need it. So I went to 4 banks in a row, turned down, and I'm running out of time. So finally, I'm outside the Bank of America in West Covina, California, a place called Citrus Avenue, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I was getting myself pumped up physiologically. I know now what I was doing, but I was getting in this really strong state, so I go in there to convince somebody. I walked in, looked for somebody who looked persuadable, and there's this kind-looking woman, kind eyes. I thought, she'll understand. So I walked up to her with all the energy I had, shook her hand, probably shook it off, and said, I'm Tony Robbins. I'm here today to borrow $200. I don't want that money to repair something. I don't want it for a vacation. I want it so I can attend a seminar. And she had this weird look on her face, like I'm not getting through to her. And she said, okay, young man, well, let me see your application. Settle down, and she goes, I appreciate your intensity and passion. And so she's reading it, and she sees my address is on Citrus Avenue. It's a commercial street that goes through 4 cities. There's no apartments on it. So she says, Citrus Avenue. Where's your apartment on Citrus Avenue? I said, well, I don't really have an apartment. I have kind of a mobile home. And she said, a mobile home. So I told her the truth. I'm sleeping in my car at 24 hours between Denny's and 7-Eleven. They don't make me move. I talk to the mailman. He gives me my mail because he understands what I'm going through. So if you send it there, I'll get it. And her eyes are getting like this. And then she says, so you want the bank to loan you money, and we'll send the bill to the 7-Eleven, and you'll be in your mobile car sleeping. She goes, and you're 17 years old. I said, what does that matter? She goes, you can't sign a contract till you're 18. I said, I'll be 18 soon. She said, how soon? I said, I assume you have to be 18. I'll be 18 in 2 weeks. She goes, well, you probably. I just don't think the bank's going to loan it to you. And I was like, no, no, you understand, I've got to do this. I got even more passionate. She said, listen. And she looked at me and said, you're serious about this, aren't you? I said, as serious as a heart attack. I'm going to use everything I learn. I'm going to do all these things. And she said, I've never met anybody quite like you. She said, if you look me in the eye and swear to me I will never have to come looking for you, because I'm not going to 7-Eleven or Denny's, I will do everything I can to get the bank to help you. But if they won't, I'll loan you the money. But you better take this seriously. And I jumped across the desk, kissed her. She wasn't ready for that stuff. And I said, I always tell people you gave me my start. And that's why I've always told the story. And her name was Mrs. Williams, and she got the loan, though she didn't have to do it. I don't know how she did. Maybe she co-signed, I don't know, but I took $200, which makes me emotional now remembering it. And all the money in the world was more expensive than the car I was sleeping in. And I went to Jim Rohn's seminar, and I met a man there named Mike Keyes, who's still my friend today, 45 plus years later, and he had just a little bit more money than me, and he said, look, stay in my hotel. You don't have to stay in your car. And we were both pretty broke, and a lot of very wealthy people were there learning from him. But because of that, like I said, it's like we were writing every word. I had to go to the bathroom and everything, but at one point I figured out every word was worth like 3 cents or some ridiculous thing. But I was so committed. And then Jim Rohn years later, I spoke at his funeral. He's a beautiful man. He would start his seminars and say, you know, every time I get up there, I want to do a good job because you never know who's in your audience. And he'd tell the story about this kid who was in his room shouting out answers, and he'd go, you know, it was Tony Robbins. And today, there's people all around the world. And then he also would tell the story about Mike, the 2 guys that were the most broke, because we probably applied it as much or more than most people would. So let me ask you, what's your $1-200 decision? What's that thing you know you need to do, but fear, excuses, or how is holding you back? Listen, Mrs. Williams didn't just loan me money, she loaned me belief, and that's what I'm giving you right now. The world doesn't change until you change, so stand up, get angry, get desperate, get committed. Banks say no. Life knocks you down, good. Now prove them wrong, because when you burn the boats and go all in. Destiny has no choice but to meet you halfway. Now go build your life.